Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. I wanted to talk a little bit about John Calipari and his Kentucky Wildcats, who right now are in a little bit of trouble after on Sunday they lost their third game in a row. And Kentucky fans are pretty upset with Coach John Calipari right now, and let's get into it. It's one thing if you lose on a buzzer beater to a really good team, or even like you did to Kansas, where it was a really close game. Both guys were in the race the whole way. But man, that is not what happened. Georgia Tech outplayed Kentucky for most of the game, and still, about midway through the second half, I thought the game was still there for Kentucky to take, and there was a possibility where maybe they could have used this game as a season-changing win. And with a lot of other Kentucky teams in the past, I feel like they've been able to use a game like this where not necessarily are they expected to win when you look at the court the first 10 minutes, but as time goes on, they just use that athleticism, they use their advantage, and ultimately they're able to get the job done. And I feel like there was a slight possibility that this game against Georgia Tech could have been one of those games where Kentucky could take this game and turn their season around. But unfortunately, if you watched, that is not what happened, as Georgia Tech ended up getting the job done. And most Kentucky fans thought the Kansas and Richmond games were bad, but at least both of those teams were really good. Georgia Tech going into this game lost to Georgia State and Mercer, and I understand why. Josh Pastner was trying to get ahead of the coronavirus world and do contactless practices, and this was the first time ever John Calipari, an assistant coach of his, beat him head-to-head. So when you combine all of those factors, I do think there are a lot of concerns to come out of the Georgia Tech game on Sunday for Kentucky. Georgia Tech's record isn't as bad as it indicates. They have veterans. But I feel like if you're Kentucky, this was a game you needed, and the way the game went is just not acceptable. Georgia Tech ended up winning the game 79-62, and this was another game where a team full of grown men just bullied Kentucky, and the Wildcats really got outplayed for the third game in a row. And Kentucky fans are really upset. I understand why, and this continues a trend that really has been going on for the last couple years with Kentucky and these Coach Cal freshman-led teams. This is the third year in a row Kentucky has really struggled during non-conference portion of the schedule. 2 years ago, they lost to Duke, they lost to Seton Hall, but they bounced back really nicely. Last year, they took an embarrassing loss to Evansville, they lost to Utah, and they ended up winning the SEC. Then you fast forward to this year. The Richmond game was bad, and that is a game that you wanted to win, you expected to win. But Richmond is a really good team, and okay, there are much worse losses you could take. Kansas, I know they're Kansas, but they're not that good. And that game was there for the taking. Also, in the Richmond game, there was never for 1 second where you thought Kentucky was ever going to win that game. Richmond was the better team from really start to finish, especially in the second half. I know the game was really close throughout the first half, but Richmond was not going anywhere that whole game. And Kansas did the same thing. Kentucky had a big lead on them. You saw a little spark early in that Kansas game that, okay, Kentucky, maybe this thing is getting itself going. But really, since that first half against Kansas, Kentucky really just has not been that good of a basketball team. And the bottom line is, with that Kansas game, they're not even that good, and the game was super winnable, and still, you were not able to get the job done. Neither team really deserved to win that Kansas game, just Kansas deserved to lose less. I would have loved to see Kentucky come out a little desperate and a little better today and earn a W that could maybe catapult them with some momentum going into their next couple of games in their non-conference schedule, which, let's be honest with ourselves, it's pretty hard. UCLA, Notre Dame, I don't think anyone right now could match up Kentucky against really any Power 5 team and say that they're definitely going to win. So the concerns are real, and there are issues that need to be spoken about. What happened versus Georgia Tech is a common trend that has been going on for Kentucky in the first 3 games, and there were even some positives. But even with those positives being taken into consideration, it still never felt to me like Kentucky was going to win this game. And it's upsetting because the game was really there for the taking. Kentucky wasn't able to run offense, their point guard struggles continued, and they had more turnovers than assists. 21 turnovers, 16 assists on Sunday, which is actually an improvement compared to what they did against Kansas and Richmond the last couple weeks. They don't have pieces that seem to fit together, and Kentucky as a team is just not living up to expectations. Olivier Sarr was 1 of 4 from the field against Georgia Tech, and let's be honest, he was playing scared. And Moses Wright and some of the other Georgia Tech big men were really getting to him. Devin Askew is a freshman, and I get that. But let's be honest with ourselves. This was a kid that was brought into Lexington to be the starting point guard of Kentucky. That is a position that has many responsibilities, that was played by many great players, and when you take on that responsibility, we got to be honest with ourselves. He's just not getting the job done. And the bottom line is, it just doesn't look like right now he's ready to play at this level. And I'm not saying that eventually he can't, and keep in mind, he did reclassify. He should technically be in high school right now, but at the same time, I don't think we could use that as an excuse. Devin Askew signed up for this. And if I'm just being completely honest with you, in order for Kentucky to be better, they're going to need better point guard play. And right now, I don't know if that's really a guarantee, because there is no Ashton Hagans on this team. There is no Tyler Eulis on this team, a guy who is on the ball leading the way, and a guy that has been through the battles, who has been through the wars. I think Kentucky fans are finally realizing how important of a player Ashton Hagans was over the last couple of years. And I don't know if John Calipari has a choice. And that is my first major issue with this Kentucky team. That a lot of times with these freshmen, right, you'll have a Terrence Clark or a BJ Boston who both played much better yesterday, and I think we could all agree those are two really good basketball players, and even though Terrence Clark really did not play well against Kansas, we still believe that he could be a guy that is going to be a really good college basketball player. But at the same time, I don't know if we could say that about Devin Askew. And once again, it's nothing against the kid, but he hasn't shown me really anything throughout the first couple games of this season that he's going to be able to be the starting point guard for this Kentucky team. When Georgia Tech went into a 2-3 zone, the game just felt too fast, and whenever he caught the ball, instantly his first reaction was to pass. He went 1 of 2 shooting from the field with 1 assist. And once again, I do think there were some positives for Kentucky in this game, unlike the game against Richmond, unlike the game against Kansas. Terrence Clark played a great game. He had 22 points. BJ Boston, 3 made 3-pointers. That is something that against Kansas and against Richmond he was not able to do at all. Isaiah Jackson is a monster who looks like he could be the real deal and maybe a surprise one and done. He is one of the most exciting players in the country to watch. Kentucky also went 8 of 19 from 3. That's a really good improvement when you compare it to the Kansas and the Richmond game. But the bottom line is, does any of it matter? To be honest with you, the answer is no. And as unfortunate as it is, it's because Kentucky just isn't really getting any better. And this loss against Georgia Tech, I think, was one of the worst losses of the John Calipari era. Calipari is a great coach. That is one of the best I've ever seen, especially considering his track record of how well all of his teams play leading into the March Madness tournament. But at the same time, I do think it's reasonable for Kentucky fans to start having some serious questions. If you want to question how he's building the roster, I think that's fine and fair and valid. But at the same time, I also feel like that's a conversation for another day. If you don't get the elite college basketball player like the Zion Williamson or the Anthony Davis, then usually you're going to have to be successful through depth and production from many different players on your squad. And the bottom line is, not all freshmen are usually ready to play right away instantly and be the main focus guy. To be honest, I think that's something we're really learning right now with this Kentucky team. And it's hard because usually when Kentucky teams get really good, they either have that top-notch Anthony Davis type player, or they'll have a guy that's been around the program for a couple of years, like an Ashton Hagans or a PJ Washington. And the problem is, getting those guys to stay in school for multiple years is so hard, because we all know if you go to Kentucky, eventually you're going to want to play in the NBA. And it's very rare that a player is all of a sudden going to get drafted as a senior from Kentucky into the NBA and succeed. I'm not saying it can't happen. We've just never seen it before. So I think there are two things that can be true about Coach John Calipari. We can say, oh yeah, he's Coach Cal. He's been through this many times before, and you always will trust his ability to get the job done. But at the same time, I actually do understand why Kentucky fans are a little frustrated. John Calipari makes a lot of money. He has one of the deepest assistant coaching staffs in the country, and they are getting out-executed each and every game. Both of those things are true. I get why Kentucky fans are saying that why is it only us when we watch our team, right? They're not good until February every year when we watch plenty of other teams around college basketball start freshmen and succeed, like Duke. And it's not only the other elite programs in college basketball that are bringing in one-and-done type talent. John Calipari is a guy that's been doing that over the past 15 years. I don't think all of a sudden he's going to instantly change that. But I do feel like the programs that are good each and every year, like Kentucky, don't have to wait until February to figure it out. North Carolina played in Maui at North Carolina for the Maui Invitational this past week. They started 3 freshmen in their rotation. They played huge minutes, and they all looked really good. It is very important to realize John Calipari's history, plus the weird offseason. And I get why Kentucky fans are upset, but we have to understand that this is part of the deal. Just look at exactly what has happened the last 2 seasons. John Calipari and Kentucky get smoked by Duke somehow, some way. They find themselves 1 win away against Auburn in the Elite Eight, and that was really a game that they should have won. You go to the next year, they take an embarrassing loss to Evansville, and all of a sudden you turn around and they're winning the SEC regular season title. So John Calipari figures it out usually, and he also knows that it is important to get the job done. But at the same time, he also gets paid bank, and I do feel like it's very fair to ask why Kentucky is never good until February each and every year. And you could say the team is young, but that is the case with many other teams around college basketball. Kansas, Duke, they all have new rosters. Even some other teams in the SEC, Bama, Arkansas, a lot of other SEC teams have new rosters, and they look great. When you're in John Calipari's spot, I think it's fair to question what is going on. However, the problem is when you compare this Kentucky team to other Kentucky's team, none of those teams were as inexperienced as this one or had a pandemic to manage. You combine that with the lack of the point guard, I think this Kentucky team, there are worries to be concerned about. The Georgia Tech game was there for the taking. The Kansas game was there for the taking. Players have been okay, but I do think out of the last couple of years, this could be the most concerning team yet just because of the point guard spot, and I don't know if John Calipari is going to have any answers anytime soon. I understand you get Keon Brooks back. I understand that Davion Mintz has played pretty well, and he shot the ball well, but he's really better off the ball, I think. So I do believe that John Calipari is really going to have to come up with other ways in order to get this team to succeed as soon as possible. And I think there are some reasons to be concerned about Kentucky, but at the same time, it's also fair to say he's John Calipari. He'll get the job done. And the reason why I keep talking about Kentucky on this podcast is because each and every week, I just think they're one of the more intriguing stories in all of college basketball. But anyways, I'm really looking forward to see what Kentucky will do over their next couple games. The schedule really doesn't get any easier.